Everybody, it's o'clock, so we're gonna get started. First of all, happy Independence Day to everybody, belated, and hope you guys had a good time celebrating and with your loved ones. And now we'll continue with our class today. So we're on class 7 of the Personal Finance from Mystery to Mastery session, and we're starting with the borrowing pillar. So we've covered earlier savings, we've covered investing, and now we're on borrowing, which is our second to last pillar. So we've made a lot of progress. And as we'll see, borrowing is one of the most misunderstood pillars. And so this is, in my view, one of the most important sessions that we're going to have, because thoroughly understanding borrowing and the risks and the rewards of borrowing is something that most people don't appreciate and understand in finance. So hopefully it'll be a rewarding session for you guys, and let's get started with it. So just a quick recap of what we did last time. And for any new viewers today, if they want to catch up, just go to our YouTube channel and watch our Personal Finance from Mystery to Mastery session. All of our episodes are on there. And so you can catch up in case you missed anything. But last time we covered our final session on investing. We covered what active investing is versus passive, what is right for whom. And then we put all our advice on investing together and gave you our final recommendations in terms of do's and don'ts. And we introduced briefly this pillar on borrowing. So today we're going to cover in this class, firstly, we're going to introduce borrowing and figure out why it's so misunderstood. We're going to understand the value of borrowing smartly. We're going to understand the dangers of borrowing poorly. And we're going to understand how a lender evaluates borrowers. And this knowledge together, we'll figure out for the introduce for our next class, how to optimize borrowing for your lives, your financial lives. Okay, so let's start with understanding why borrowing is so controversial. So as we discussed, it's one of the most polarizing topics in finance. You pretty much have 2 points of view for most people in borrowing. So either they are extremely conservative and their viewpoints are encapsulated here. Borrowing is a surefire way to ruin. There's a bad social stigma. It never makes financial sense to borrow, and I'll never do it under any circumstance. So you have some people like that. And then on the other pole, you have people that say, you know what, borrowing is great. It lets me pull forward my consumption. I can buy a bigger car, a bigger house than I could afford without borrowing. And what's the risk? I'm just going to earn more and more as my salaries increase and as my career progresses. So I'll eventually be able to pay it down. So what's the risk, you know? And the truth, as we're going to explore in this session, lies squarely in the middle. As with so many things, the answer, the correct approach to borrowing in our view is the medium path. And that's what we're going to explore here. So let's spend a little bit of time just understanding the borrowing transaction at a glance, right? So let's figure out the moving parts and make sure we're all talking about the same language and definitions, etc. So in a borrowing transaction, there are two parties. There's the borrower, who's receiving the funds, and the lender, who's providing the funds. And essentially, why is the lender providing the funds? Because he is going to get repaid the funds plus a fee, right? So in borrowing terminology, we typically call the amount the borrower borrowed, we call that the principal. And the fee portion of what the lender receives, we call interest. So the lender is giving the money to the borrower to use today because he expects to be repaid in the future along with the fee, along with the interest he collects in that transaction. And typically the borrower is borrowing this money for certain use, right? You wouldn't borrow money if you didn't need it for something. So we typically call the use of the funds the use of proceeds. So when a borrowing transaction works, it's a win-win for everybody. So the borrower gets money to apply for whatever use they want, and they are happy because they're able to do that. and the lender gets to deploy excess money that they have, and they earn a return, a fee for giving that capital to the borrower. So everybody is happy and the transaction goes smoothly, and eventually the borrower repays the lender plus the fee. When borrowing goes wrong, on the other hand, it can turn into a disaster for everybody. The borrower runs into difficulty, he can't repay the loan, and the lender is unhappy because he can't get his money back. And the borrower is unhappy because his credit history is ruined and he may lose the asset that he borrowed against. So, this gives you a sense of the double edged nature of borrowing. It definitely comes with risks, it definitely comes with rewards. What we're going to focus on today is understanding when it helps and when it hurts. So let's start with understanding a certain use case that's going to help us understand why people borrow. So let's say that you own a chain of Chinese restaurants and you learn that a competitor wants to sell his restaurant in an area that you anyway want to expand in. Unfortunately, you don't have the money to buy his restaurant. So what do, right? I mean, he's going to sell this restaurant to somebody else. This is an area you anyway want to expand into. How are you going to raise these funds? So the most straightforward way to do it is to borrow money from a bank or from some lender, right? And that's the quickest and cheapest way usually that you can raise money like this. And that's why you borrow. So now let's understand what happens in this transaction. So let's say I borrowed to buy this restaurant. Let's say the cost of this restaurant was 15 lakhs and I had to pay an interest rate of 10% on my money borrowed. That's the fee I'm going to pay the lender. So what I'm giving in this transaction is I'm giving an annual cost of borrowing of 1.5 lakhs, right? That's just the 10% times the 15 lakhs. And what am I getting in return? Well, I use the money to buy a restaurant, right? And now let's say this restaurant did a turnover of around 25 lakhs. And let's say it had a profit margin of 10%. That means that with this money, I was able to get a profit of 2.5 lakhs. So that's what I'm getting. So now very simply, we can see that it made financial sense for me to do this transaction because I'm getting more than I'm giving. And this is going to lead us to the real way that borrowing can help, and a framework for analyzing when to use borrowing and when not to use borrowing. If you're going to get more than you're going to give, then the transaction is beneficial for you. So this is clearly a beneficial case. We're getting 2.5 lakhs and we're giving 1.5 lakhs. This may seem really simple, but most of the time when we're borrowing money, I don't think we really apply this framework. And if we just do this simple framework, you'll see that you can use borrowing smartly to help you create wealth and not have borrowing destroy wealth. So let's understand this a little more. So what did we do in that scenario? Why did borrowing help us? Why was it smart to borrow? We were able to use the borrowing to create wealth. So what was the secret? Why did wealth get created in that example? We made sure that whatever we were using the borrowing funds for gave us more value than we owed the lender as a fee. And that was what allowed us to create wealth. So oftentimes, a lot of people, not just beginners, including intermediate and advanced financial practitioners, think of borrowing as a way to achieve dreams. It's not really a way to achieve dreams because that's essentially misusing borrowing. Instead, the way I like to think about borrowing is it's a tool. It's a tool that allows you to invest properly. And if you're investing in things that give you more than you're paying, then it can help you earn more in your financial career and life. And if you use it to instead spend on things like a larger house than you need, or a fancy car, or a big screen TV, you're not going to be creating wealth for yourself, and you actually risk destroying wealth for yourself. So we're going to again explore how to generate wealth through borrowing. So let's look at some examples. So on the left, I have some smart borrowing, and on the right, I have some less smart borrowing. So let's try and understand the differences. So education. I'm getting an MBA to see an increase in my wages. So why is this smart? Because I'm using something to increase my earnings. And as long as the increase in earnings is greater than the interest I owe the bank, this is going to create wealth for me. So that's why education can often be a really, really good use of proceeds when you're borrowing money. Let's say a business. Let's say that I own a dental practice, but I don't have a X-ray machine, right? And I have a lot of patients that have to go somewhere else to get dental x-rays done. It's bad for the patient, it's bad for me because I can't collect fees on that, and my patients have to go an extra step to collect the x-rays. Well, if I had some money and I could buy an x-ray machine, then I could collect that revenue, my patients would be happier, and my business would do better. So that's another great use of proceeds when it comes to borrowing, funding growth in your business. Another one, home ownership. If you're buying a home as an investment and you believe this investment will do well over a long period of time, you're buying in a good area, you see price appreciation as a possibility, then even home ownership can be a very, very good use for borrowing money. Now let's understand some less smart categories for borrowing. Okay, so the most tempting for a lot of people is consumption. They go into a store, they see a TV that they plan to buy, but then they see a nicer one with a zero EMI offer. And they say, well, this borrowing's not costing me anything. Maybe I'll buy the bigger TV, right? Because it's 0% interest EMI. And that allows them to pull forward their consumption from the future and buy things they couldn't afford. Why is this not smart? Because you're adding on borrowing without increasing your earnings. So it doesn't help you in the long run create wealth. It actually results in destruction of wealth because you get in the habit of buying things you can't afford. Another one, let's say that I borrowed some money to buy Bitcoins because my friend told me that Bitcoins are a really good investment. And I said, okay, I'll just borrow some money and put it in Bitcoins. This is called speculation. You've not done your homework on the investment and you're just hoping the price goes up. This is not a strategy for long-term wealth creation. And the last one is keeping up with the Joneses. So what does this mean? It basically means for status purposes, acquiring things you can't afford. So buying an extra large house, not because you think it's a good investment, but because you want people to know you bought a house. You want them to know that you can afford to buy a house. And this is a behavior that we all do, but it can be very, very damaging. And it's not a good use of borrowing because, again, you're not looking for opportunities that can create wealth. You're just looking for ways you can enhance your status. So again, all the things on the left are areas where we are expecting to create more value than we're going to pay to the borrower. That's what defines smart borrowing. So there's one other use of borrowing that is smart, and that is helping you manage unexpected events and liquidity issues in your life. Life is full of the unexpected: medical emergencies, job losses, accidents, cash flow issues. All these things can happen with little warning. And as we discussed in our savings pillar, savings can be a very useful tool to help you manage through the unexpected. But sometimes you may need more funds than your savings allow if you run into severe problems in cash flow. And borrowing can be another tool in your arsenal to help you manage through tough times. So while this won't create wealth for you in the long run, it'll help you manage your life and smooth out potential problems that you encounter over the years. So this also is a very, very important function that borrowing can play in your life, and that's why it's a very, very good thing to have available to you various sources of credit that you can use to help you sleep soundly in case emergencies happen. Okay, so now let's understand a little bit the dangers of borrowing to fund consumption. So let's pretend that, I fell for all these traps and I ended up buying things not because they were adding to my earnings, but because they were um, essentially things that allowed me to bring forward my consumption. So I was able to buy a nicer car than I could afford. I was able to buy a flat screen TV. I was able to buy iPhone 10, right? Now all these things, right, add to my debt load. So my debt loads increase. So here you can see that, as I'm buying more and more things, the stack of money that I owe people is growing faster and faster. But because these things do not help me earn more money, just because I drive a fancier car doesn't mean I can earn more money to repay that debt, right? Just because I have a nicer TV doesn't mean I can earn more to repay the cost of that TV. So it's not helping increase my earnings. Unlike education, if I go get an MBA, then that'll help me earn more and actually repay the debt. So I get caught in what's called a debt trap. And this means that my debt is growing much faster than my earnings. So my ability to repay the debt becomes less and less over time. And I need to borrow more and more money just to repay the debt that I owe. And this causes financial ruin for a lot of people. It's not so common in India because people don't tend to borrow a lot of money in India. We have the reverse problem, which is people tend to borrow too little in India. But in the United States, this is a very, very common problem. People use their credit cards to borrow and borrow and borrow to fund a lifestyle they can't afford, and they can never repay that debt. And they ultimately end up declaring bankruptcy because they can't repay this debt. So this debt trap is definitely something you want to look out for when you're borrowing money. So even smart borrowing has some dangers that we need to understand. So let's go back to that Chinese restaurant example. So on the left is what we thought. We thought I'd get an annual expected profit of 2.5 lakhs, right? In terms of buying that restaurant, which is why we bought the restaurant. But we all know that life doesn't always go to plan. So, maybe our estimates were wrong. Maybe we didn't get as many footfalls as we thought in that new restaurant, right? So maybe what actually happened is we only got a turnover of 12 lakhs in that restaurant, and we only got a profit margin of 7%, not 10. So suddenly our annual expected profit drops to 84,000 versus the 1.5 lakhs we're owing the bank. So it's important that even when we're making smart investments and smart uses of borrowing, to always plan for the unexpected, because things may not go the way you expected. And suddenly this restaurant, which ended up creating wealth, originally what we thought, has ended up destroying wealth because we're paying more to the bank than the restaurant is giving us in income. So let's cover an even more stark example of what can go wrong. And this is a dramatic example just to show you how bad things can go if you don't pay attention to using borrowing smartly. So let's say that you thought Reliance was a surefire bet. It's a large company. It's backed by promoters that you think are smart, and it's doing things you think are good. You like what they're doing with Geo, and you think it's just a sure bet, right? So let's say in January of 2020, you invested 5 lakhs into buying Reliance shares. Now, because you thought it was safe, you decided you would borrow for part of these proceeds. You didn't have 5 lakhs to invest. You only had 2.5 lakhs, but you said, you know what, this is a safe bet. I'm going to borrow 50% so I can invest more into Reliance, so I can create wealth for myself. So you did what's called borrowing on margin to buy shares. So here we'll walk through the math. So in January 2020, I invested 5 lakhs. 50% of that came from my own savings, and 50% of that was borrowed from my broker. So 2.5 lakhs came from me, 2.5 lakhs came from the broker. And let's see how many shares I could buy in Jan 2020. I was able to, since they were trading at 1,500 rupees a share, I was able to buy 333 shares. Now let's see what happened in March 2020. We all know that that was the trough of the market. So let's see how much my shares were worth. So I owned 333 shares, right? That's the same number from here. And at the price in March 2020 of 1,000 rupees, it had gone down from 1,500 to 1,000 rupees. My investment was only worth 3.33 lakhs, right? I had originally put in 5 lakhs. Now it's only worth 3.33 lakhs. Furthermore, I borrowed for some of that, and my borrowing did not decline. I still owed 2.5 lakhs, right? So I need to take that out. So I have to pay that back to the broker. And the amount left over is only 83,000 rupees. So my own funds that I put in, 2.5 lakhs, have now turned into only 83,000 rupees. So let's take a look at the decline in investments. Reliance stock went down 33% from January to March. But if I look at the decline in the investment, it's 67%. Why? Because when you borrow, it magnifies your gains and your losses in an investment. And now the worst thing about this is, if this scenario happened, you could not even wait for Reliance shares to recover, because the lender would demand that you sell the stock to repay the loan or put more money into the account. And if you didn't have more money to put in the account, you would be forced to sell at this low price. So this is how borrowing can really, really turn against you, even when you're doing something that you think is smart. And then if we look at today's price, Reliance is back up to 2,100. But because this person borrowed and did not buy from his or her savings, they were not able to wait until the share price recovered, because the lender demanded to be repaid the loan before the stock price recovered, and they didn't have money to reinvest in margin. So that's an example of how things can go really wrong, even when you were correct, right? The person was right. Reliance stock went up from 1,500 to 2,100. But because of what happened in between, the borrowing created a problem and they weren't able to realize the investment. So, okay, is there a way to avoid this? Because this sounds really scary, that even when we're right, if we borrow wrongly, then we could end up in disaster, right? So there is an antidote. And here's our recommendations in terms of using borrowing to work well for you. If you follow these thought processes, we think you will use borrowing in the right way. So what does borrowing work well for? It works well for investments that promise a rate of return higher than the borrowing cost. So this was our example of the Chinese restaurant. When the Chinese restaurant earned more money than the interest we owed on the debt, it was a good investment for the borrowing, right? And when it earned less, it was a bad investment to borrow. The second thing is, we want investments that have a lower risk and lower uncertainty, because if things go really wrong, then we can have a disaster if we borrow. But if we don't borrow, we're not in trouble, right? So you want investments that don't move around too much. What happened in the Reliance example is the stock price moved around so much that you were forced to close the position before it recovered. So you want things that are stable and don't have a big chance of failing. And how do we do this? Well, the things that we like to use for borrowing personally at Bharosa Club is things where you have prior data to help you evaluate outcomes. So let's take that example of the dentist, right, who's looking at borrowing to add an X-ray machine. For him, he knows how many customers come into his store, right? He knows how many times he's referring the patient for an X-ray to another lab, right? And so he's able to estimate the demand and incremental money he can make from that machine very, very precisely, because he has the track record and history to do it. It's not like he's taking a gamble on something completely new. So that is a very, very good use of borrowing, where you can help frame how good or bad an investment can be based on the past history. So what are some examples that we like for borrowing? So an example could be education and skilling. So a good example of this could be, I got into IIM Ahmedabad, right? Should I go and pay the, 30 lakhs it costs me to get an MBA? Well, that's a pretty straightforward answer for most people, right? If it bumps up their earnings enough, and an IIM MBA will do that, right? It'll bump your earnings up significantly. Then it's a very good use of money to borrow. To afford that. Or opening a new store, again, a business borrowing where you're able to turn it into a low risk endeavor. If you have 15 stores running and you know generally how well a store will do when you open it, then borrowing is something that you can use because you understand the likelihood that that store will succeed or fail. But if this is a brand new store with no track record and you have no idea how to estimate if it'll do well or bad, then it may not be a good endeavor. So what is the thought process that you should use when you evaluate use of proceeds for borrowing? The first and the most important is acknowledge that there are no sure things or free lunches, and that every investment has uncertainty and risk. Every single one that you do has some element of uncertainty and risk. And we need to spend as investors most of our time thinking about what can go wrong, not what can go right. It's easy to think about what can go right, but what can go wrong and how wrong can it go is really what you need to do when you think about borrowing for investing purposes. And think through these risks, right? So let's take the example of going for an MBA program. So how do I evaluate the risk of that? Well, I can look at the placement statistics of the MBA program that I'm going to. What percentage of the class gets jobs after graduating? What is the average salary of those jobs? What is the salary range of those jobs? What's the high and low? You can ask questions to the school if they don't give you that data, right? That all helps you figure out how likely it is that you end up with a bad outcome and how bad a bad outcome can be, right? And then you can decide if you're willing to take that risk or not. If I use borrowing to buy a house, what happens if the property prices fall? How likely is it that the property prices fall? You won't get precise answers to these questions, but just simply thinking about them will help you get some sense of how much risk is in an investment. And you can't quantify these things like a science. You can't say this has 3.2 units of risk. There's no way you can do that in finance, right? It's an art. You've got to trust your bones, right? Your judgment, your gut. But the more data you look at and the more you think about it, the more sound your judgment will be. So that's really the antidote to using borrowing cleverly. So some of you may be tempted to say, it's not worth the hassle. This is too much work. I'm just not going to borrow. And in our view, that's a mistake. You'll be giving up a very valuable tool that will help you in your life, because whether it's funding your professional development or funding your kids' dreams in terms of education, giving all the opportunities that your business needs, unlocking opportunities across your life and your family's life, managing your liquidity needs, borrowing has lots of value. Don't be scared about it. Just give the appropriate level of care and thought to the downside scenarios, and you'll be able to use it when it makes sense to use. In fact, I just want to tell you guys that in the public markets, if there is a company that is not borrowing effectively, the markets usually look at that company and penalize it, because they're saying this company is not being managed correctly. They should be borrowing more. And oftentimes these companies can be taken over because they're not using a tool that can be very, very helpful in life. And that doesn't mean you need to borrow if you don't need to borrow, right? If you don't need to borrow, don't borrow, but look for ways to make that tool work for you, where it's a win-win scenario. Okay, so I'm going to briefly introduce the next topic of the next session, which is how to borrow in an effective way and how to maximize the use of this tool in your lives. So really trying to do this, we need to understand how a lender thinks about risk with a borrower. So most lenders are vitally concerned with, are you going to pay back the loan? And they don't have the resources to do detailed due diligence on every single borrower. So they rely on certain proxies to measure creditworthiness. So how much are you earning relative to the cost of the borrowing that you're going to be taking is one thing that they look at. The second is, what are you using the borrowing for? Are you using it for something risky or safe? And the third is, what is your character? Are you the type of person that's going to run away from your debt? Or are you the type of person that hell or high water, you're going to repay the loan? And they judge this by looking at your credit score. So anytime you borrow from a formal source, your credit score is updated and kept in a file at certain credit bureaus. And this happens anytime you borrow from a formal source. So if you've got a credit card, you have a credit score. You may not know you have a credit score, but you have a credit score. Um, so essentially the credit score tells the lender, your character. How reliable are you to pay back your borrowings? And it's a key ingredient for how the lender thinks about how much to charge you in terms of the fee they're going to collect. If you're riskier to the lender, they will demand a higher fee, and sometimes they won't even lend you money. So managing your credit score is a vital tool in lowering your cost of getting credit and borrowing if you ever need to. And that's something we're going to talk about in the next session. How can you maximize your credit score and use it as a weapon, your low cost of financing, to help you get even better wealth creation in your life. Having a low access to low interest rate borrowing is a key advantage. So what does this mean for you? Like, why do we care about optimizing your credit score? If you have a lower borrowing cost than your peers, you can suddenly borrow for items where they cannot borrow for. Certain investments become available to you that others cannot use borrowing to enact. You can afford a nicer home. You can afford, to use borrowing in certain circumstances that others couldn't. So it's something that's worth investing in, developing a very good credit score. So we're going to talk next class about that, and also our recommendations, more concrete recommendations on how to make borrowing really work for you in your financial life. So with that, I'll open it up for the Q&A and then we'll conclude.
Okay. So the first comment is, in the Chinese restaurant case, you also have to repay the principal.
Yes, you also have to repay the principal for sure. But really, when we look at whether something is cost effective or not, right? What we're really caring about is what is the extra incremental amount that we're paying for the loan, right? That's the fee. Repaying the principal is essentially repaying what you owe anyway. But repaying the interest cost is the fee. That's the extra amount we're paying to borrow that money. So when we're looking at cost benefit, while you always need to make sure you can repay the loan eventually, when you're looking at cost benefit and ROI, what you really want to look at is the interest cost versus the return of the investment.
Okay.
Because just to put a pin on that, because theoretically you could always pay the principal back by selling that Chinese restaurant to someone else in the future, right? So really, and in fact, if it's earning more at that point, you could even sell it back for more.
Okay. For companies, you hear of debt equity ratio. Can an individual use similar thinking?
Absolutely. So there's certain ratios, and I'll cover some of these in the next class, to look at how leveraged you are and what we recommend in terms of how much leverage is sustainable for a person and when you should look at reducing your borrowings. So there are a couple of ratios that we look at. So one is called the leverage ratio, and that is comparing your the amount you've borrowed relative to your assets. So that's one ratio. And the second is your income relative to your debt service payments. That's called your debt coverage ratio. But I'll walk you through that in more detail in the next class.
Okay. And also there's another comment on, what about borrowings for education in a foreign university? Because these days, there's unemployment, and due to regulatory forces, you may not get a job that will.
Yeah, absolutely. So the person that asked that question is showing the exact thinking methodology that you need to apply whenever you're thinking about borrowing for anything. You always have to ask yourself, what's different, what's changed, and what are the real risks that I'm taking? So you're absolutely right. The risk of a foreign education is a lot higher today than it was, say, 10 years ago. Why? Because of exactly the things that the questioners are talking about, be it the Trump administration's a sort of reluctance to grant employment visas, or be it the economic state and lack of job opportunities, there are a lot of reasons why education in the US or in any foreign locale even could be construed as riskier today than it was a few years back. And that has to be factored into your analysis. So when you're looking at the past data, you also want to ask, do I need to adjust this past data for anything to reflect the current environment? So for example, if I were trying to make this decision today, what I would do is I'd look at the placement statistics and I'd say, you know what, I don't feel as confident about my odds of getting a job today as this data, is indicating, because back then it was a little easier. So maybe I'll factor in a lower salary assumption. Maybe I'll look at the risk that I have to come back to India and earn in lower salary jobs in India. What do these scenarios look like? And am I willing to take that risk? Or is it too high a risk to ever take? And that's kind of the analysis you have to do in those circumstances. But great question.
There's a question on reverse mortgage. What are the upsides and downsides of a reverse mortgage?
So, to be honest, I'm not really familiar all too well with the reverse mortgage. I can research it and come back to you. But essentially, reverse mortgage, a lot of it's going to depend on your life expectancy in terms of how good a reverse mortgage is in terms of a financial transaction for you. So essentially, the reverse mortgage, for people that aren't familiar with it, is essentially using a property that you own as a source to collect revenue by giving a ownership claim to that property to a lender, and then using that ownership claim to collect income from the bank. So really what's going to determine how good of a transaction that is really going to be determined by how long you live and how much income you're able to collect via versus how much you're giving to the bank. But let me do a research on it and I'll come back to the question now.
Okay. So there's one more thing that I'd just like to add on reverse mortgages. And that is, whether you have heirs, whether you want to give that property to someone when, say, you and maybe your spouse pass away. So that also becomes a factor, because if you have no heirs, then, this property, when you pass away or your spouse passes away, or your heirs are, say, a lot of people have property maybe in India and their children are in the US, or they have property in the US and the children are, say, in the UK, or they don't want anything to do with the property, right? So in that case, having that property revert to the lender, the person who's giving you the reverse mortgage, when both you and your spouse die, is a plus for you. And you can enjoy some extra income while you're living, while retaining the rights of living in that property. So that's why this product sort of came about. But it's not a very popular product, because the lender has to factor in all kinds of things as to life expectancy, not only of you and your spouse, so that the payments that they make on the reverse mortgage are not all that high. And they also have to factor in that this property may go down. So if you start looking at what kind of annuity payments you can get, you may not get such great payments.
Yeah, it's typically, I think those are exactly great comments. I think it's typically used to manage cash flow problems in retirement. But yeah, we'll come back to the questioner with detailed thoughts. Let me just do a little bit of research on it and I'll give you some concrete views.
Is it good to take a housing loan or rent a house and invest the surplus fund?
Yeah, so we did a video on our thoughts on real estate. So I'll refer the questioner to that video. It's available on our YouTube channel. Short answer, and just watch the video to get our views. Our personal views, given where rental yields are in India and where borrowing costs are in India, unless you expect a lot of appreciation in property prices, which we personally do not, but you could be living in an area where you think there'll be a lot of appreciation, we don't think it makes a lot of sense financially to buy a house, right, as an investment. That being said, it still could make sense for you because you like the security of having a house, emotional aspects and stability aspects. So that's kind of our view.
Okay. If you took advantage of moratorium, will it affect your credit score?
No, if you took advantage of the moratorium, it wouldn't affect your credit score. But our advice in terms of the moratorium would be that generally try to pay back your debts if you're able to, as soon as you're able to pay them back, because the interest is not waived for that period. So it's not free money, right? Particularly if you have high interest rate borrowings, if you're not paying back for the moratorium period, those are going to make the tenor of your loan much, much longer, and it'll take you longer to pay them down. So if you're able to pay them down, then pay them down. Otherwise, don't worry, take the moratorium. It won't impact your credit score as long as you get current once the moratorium expires.
That's it. I don't think there are any more questions. So I guess we can call it a day.
Okay, great. And we will continue with borrowing next time. And thanks everyone for joining, and let us know any suggestions you have. Thank you.